Hey guys, it's Mrs. Baiades again. We are going to read chapter 3 today. And let's just review chapter 2 again. We found out that at the ceremony of 12, you receive your assignment, which is your job for life. And you get this by the elders, a council of elders, assigning you one. So you don't get to pick your job. And so Jonas doesn't really have any ideas of what his job is going to be. He's done volunteer hours in lots of different places, so he's a little concerned. All right, moving on to chapter 3. Oh, look, Lily squealed in delight. Isn't he cute? Look how tiny he is, and he has funny eyes like yours, Jonas. Jonas glared at her. He didn't like it that she had mentioned his eyes. He waited for his father to chastise Lily, but father was busy unstrapping the carrying basket from the back of his bicycle. Jonas walked over to look. It was the first thing Jonas noticed as he looked at the new child peering up curiously from the basket, the pale eyes. Almost every citizen in the community had dark eyes. His parents did, and Lily did, and so did all his group members and friends. But there were a few exceptions. Jonas himself, and a female 5 who he had noticed had the different lighter eyes. No one mentioned such things. It was not a rule, but was considered rude to call attention to things that were unsettling or different about individuals. Lily, he decided, would have to learn that soon, or she would be called in for chastisement because of her insensitive chatter. Chastisement means like being scolded, guys, or being told, you've done something wrong. Father put his bike into its port. Then he picked up the basket and carried it into the house. Lily followed behind, but she glanced back over her shoulder at Jonas and teased, "Maybe he had the same birth mother as you." Jonas shrugged. He followed them inside, but he had been startled by the new child's eyes. Mirrors were rare in the community. They weren't forbidden, but there was no real need of them. And Jonas had simply never bothered to look at himself very often, even when he found himself in a location where a mirror did exist. Now, seeing the new child and its expression, he was reminded that the light eyes were not only a rarity, but gave the one who had them a certain look. What was it? Depth, he decided, as if one were looking into the clear water of the river, down to the bottom where things might lurk which hadn't been discovered yet. He felt self-conscious, realizing that he too had that look. So just to recap here, what we're noticing is that this new child that father has brought home has the same, quote, funny eyes that Jonas has. And the reason is just because they're different. They're lighter, and everybody else usually has dark eyes. He went to his desk, pretending not to be interested in the new child. On the other side of the room, Mother and Lily were bending over to watch as father unwrapped its blanket. "What's his comfort object called?" Lily asked, picking up the stuffed creature, which had been placed beside the new child in his basket. Father glanced at it. "Hippo," he said. Lily giggled at the strange word. "Hippo," she repeated, and put the comfort object down again. She peered at the unwrapped new child and waved his arms. "I think new children are so cute," Lily sighed. "I hope I get assigned to be a birth mother." "Lily," Mother spoke very sharply, "don't say that. There's very little honor in that assignment." "But I was talking to Natasha, the 10 who lives around the corner. She does some of her volunteer hours at the birthing center, and she told me that the birth mothers get wonderful food and they have very gentle exercise periods. And most of the time they just play games and amuse themselves while they're waiting. I think I'd like that," Lily said petulantly. 3 years, Mother told her firmly. 3 births, and that's all. After that, they are laborers for the rest of their adult lives, until the day that they enter the house of the old. Is that what you want, Lily? 3 lazy years and then hard physical labor until you are old? "Well, no, I guess not," Lily acknowledged reluctantly. Father turned the new child onto its tummy in the basket. He sat beside it and rubbed its small back with a rhythmic motion. "Anyway, Lily Billy," he said affectionately, "the birth mothers never even get to see the new children. If you enjoy the little ones so much, you should hope for an assignment as nurturer." When you're an 8 and start your volunteer hours, you may try some at the nurturing center, Mother suggested. Yes, I think I will, Lily said. She knelt beside the basket. What did you say his name is? Gabriel? Hello, Gabriel, she said in a sing-song voice. Then she giggled. Oops, she whispered. I think he's asleep. I guess I'd better be quiet. Okay, so guys, just to recap here, Lily says she would love to be a birth mother. We're now learning that a birth mother is a job. So giving birth to children is a job in this community. It's something that you do for a living. And you only have 3 children. So anyone who's a birth mother gives birth to 3 children, 1 a year. And then after your job as birth mother is done, you then become a laborer, which means doing like physical labor, like hard kind of moving stuff or things like that. And so mother's reaction to this is a little bit funny because she is actually says it's not a good job, that it's not really a worthy job, but yet what if we didn't have birth mothers? It seems like a very silly reaction for mother to say, you shouldn't want that job, and that it's just, 3 lazy years. Yet we look at motherhood as one of the most important jobs in our community. So kind of an interesting thing to think about. All right, so now I'm here down at the bottom, and Lily just said she'd better be quiet, and Jonas is going to kind of poke fun at her for that. Jonas turned to the school assignments on his desk. Some chance of that, he thought. Lily was never quiet. Probably she should hope for an assignment as speaker so that she could sit in the office with a microphone all day, making announcements. He laughed silently to himself, picturing his sister droning on in the self-important voice that all the speakers seemed to develop, saying things like, "Attention, this is a reminder to females under 9 that hair ribbons are to be neatly tied at all times." He turned toward Lily and noticed to his satisfaction that her ribbons were, as usual, undone and dangling. There would be an announcement like that quite soon, he felt certain. And it would be directed mainly at Lily, though her name, of course, would not be mentioned. Everyone would know. Everyone had known, he remembered with humiliation, that the announcement, "Attention, this is a reminder to male 11s that objects are not to be removed from the recreation area and that snacks are to be eaten, not hoarded," had been specifically directed to him the day last month that he had taken an apple home. No one had mentioned it, not even his parents, because the public announcement had been sufficient to produce the appropriate remorse. He had, of course, disposed of the apple and made his apology to the recreation director the next morning before school. Jonas thought about that incident. He was still bewildered by it. Not by the announcement or the necessary apology. Those were standard procedures, and he had deserved them. But by the incident itself. He probably should have brought up his feeling of bewilderment that very evening when the family unit had shared their feelings of the day. But he had not been able to sort out and put words to the source of his confusion, so he had let it pass. All right, so before I continue, guys, I just want to talk about a couple of things. He first talks about how Lily never shuts up, and so he says that she should have a job as a speaker. And then he mentions a couple times where, the speakers will come over and say something. Like, for example, this is a reminder that females need to have their hair ribbons tied. And he's specifically saying that announcement's going to come up because Lily's are not tied. So they won't just come out and say, "Hey, Lily, tie your hair ribbons," but they're going to make an announcement that all 9s should have them tied. And then Lily will know, oh, right, that's me. And a very similar thing happened with Jonas when they made an announcement to all male 11s that objects are not to be removed from a recreation area because he had taken an apple without asking. And so they knew this. And so they made the announcement, a general announcement, and he knew it was geared towards him, even though they didn't say, "Hey, Jonas, you need to put that back." But I mean, think about it. We do things like this all the time, guys. Think about when I say to everybody, guys, everybody should be paying attention and, or something like that, or all cameras should be on, even though I'm not saying, so-and-so should have their camera on. The person who doesn't have the camera on obviously knows it's them. So these are things that we kind of do as well. But what's interesting about this is that I'd like you to think about how the heck could they have known that Lily's hair ribbons were not tied and that he took the apple from the recreation room? Think about that for a minute. How would the community have known that? Kind of an interesting thing, right? What must they have in this community if they knew that those things were happening? So think about that. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happened with the apple and why he took it. Jonas thought again about the incident. He was still bewildered by it. Oh, sorry, I already read that part. Let's go down here. It had happened during the recreation period when he had been playing with Asher. Jonas had casually picked up an apple from the basket where the snacks were kept and had thrown it to his friend. Asher had thrown it back, and they had begun a simple game of catch. There had been nothing special about it. It was an activity that he had performed countless times. Throw, catch, throw, catch. It was effortless for Jonas and even boring, though Asher enjoyed it. And playing catch was a required activity for Asher because it would improve his hand-eye coordination, which was not up to its standards. But suddenly Jonas had noticed, following the path of the apple through the air with his eyes, that the piece of the fruit had, well, this was the part that he couldn't adequately understand. The apple had changed. Just for an instant. It had changed in midair, he remembered. Then it was in his hand, and he looked at it carefully, but it was the same apple. Unchanged. The same size and shape, a perfect sphere. The same nondescript shade, about the same shade of his own tunic. A tunic, guys, is a shirt. There was absolutely nothing remarkable about that apple. He had tossed it back and forth between his hands a few times, then thrown it to Asher, and again in the air. For an instant only, it had changed. It had happened 4 times. Jonas had blinked, looked around, and then tested his eyesight, squinting at the small print on the identification badge attached to his tunic. He read his name quite clearly. He could also clearly see Asher at the other end of the throwing area, and he had no problem catching the apple. Jonas had been completely mystified. Ash, he had called, does anything seem strange to you about the apple? Yes, Asher called back, laughing. It jumps out of my hand onto the ground. Asher had just dropped it once again. So Jonas laughed too, and with the laughter tried to ignore his uneasy conviction that something had happened. But he had taken the apple home against the recreation area rules. That evening, before his parents and Lily arrived at the dwelling, he had held it in his hands and looked at it very carefully. It was slightly bruised now, because Asher had dropped it several times. But there was nothing at all unusual about the apple. He had held a magnifying glass to it. He had tossed it several times across the room, watching, and then rolled it around and around on the desktop, waiting for the thing to happen again. But it hadn't. The only thing that happened was the announcement later that evening over the speaker, the announcement that had singled him out without using his name, that had caused both of his parents to glance meaningfully at his desk where the apple still lay. Now, sitting at his desk, staring at his schoolwork as his family hovered over the new child in its basket, he shook his head, trying to forget the odd incident. He forced himself to arrange his papers and try to study a little before the evening meal. The new child, Gabriel, stirred and whimpered, and father spoke softly to Lily, explaining the feeding process as he opened the container that held the formula and equipment. So, guys, you're going to make a prediction. I want to see what you think happened to the apple. Okay, so you're going to answer that question where I want you to tell me, what do you think changed about the apple? What was he seeing? All right, continuing on. The evening proceeded as all evenings did in the family unit, in the dwelling, in the community, quiet, reflective, a time for renewal and preparation for the day to come. It was different only in the addition to it of the new child with the pale, solemn, knowing eyes.